father of Pan-Africanism globally. And so many people around the world who study and who examine the history acknowledge that W.E.B. Du Bois played a significant role in global Pan-Africanism. And so they call him the father of Pan-Africanism. And it's very interesting that Henry Sylvester Williams was one of the principal organizers of the first Pan-African Conference, and many scholars credit Henry Sylvester Williams with coining the term Pan-Africanism. And I think that is very interesting because as we look at the beginning of the whole Pan-African movement, it actually started as an ideal that probably goes back to people like Dr. Martin Delany, who was one of the highest ranking black military officials in the Civil War. He also traveled to Africa and negotiated a treaty in the region known as Nigeria for land to establish an independent black republic made up of black Americans. And he did that before the Civil War. But in terms of ideology and philosophy and all those things, Henry Sylvester Williams is the one who is credited with coining the actual term Pan-Africanism. But Du Bois is known as the father of Pan-Africanism. And I want to go into talking about that because I think it's very significant. First of all, Du Bois was born in 1868, the year that black people became citizens of the United States via the 14th Amendment. Du Bois grew up in an environment where he lived in the era of time when there was a lot of lynching. There were mob attacks on black communities, black towns and cities, and communities of black people that made tremendous progress after the Civil War. Their towns were attacked. They were mob attacked, very similar to we hear about the popular event of the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Many of us hear about the Wilmington Massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, and many of us hear about Rosewood, Florida. But there were over 100 such incidents that took place around the country. And Du Bois grew up during a period of time when this was fairly common. In addition to that, black people's right to vote was suppressed. That the black men had received the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, but by 1901 there were no blacks in Congress. Through racism, through gerrymandered election districts, through use of terrorism, literacy tests, poll taxes, at-large elections, and all types of systemic ways of disenfranchising black people from voting. We found ourselves in a situation where the black community had no representation in the United States Congress for a whole generation from about 1901 until about 1929. So Du Bois actually grew up in an era of time that was very troubled in terms of black people's living situation in the Americas. But what was unique about Du Bois, he was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He lived in a pretty isolated area that had some level of integration, and he had access to education. So he went to an integrated high school. And of course, he was very conscious of the fact that his great-grandfather had come to America from West Africa as a slave, and he had a very good record of his family history. So he had a very strong sense of who he was and confidence and understanding of who he was. And he also recognized the existence of racism, even though he wasn't exposed to maybe some of the real horrors of racism that someone that lived in the South was. But nevertheless, he was a precocious student. He was someone who who set himself to learn. He graduated from Fisk University in 1888. And he, of course, graduated from high school around the same time as the Berlin Conference occurred in Germany, and Africa was divided into colonial territories. So Du Bois grew up in an environment where he was conscious of what was going on in the world. So he saw not only what was happening to black people in America, but because he was in a environment that had an international nature to it in terms of his college experiences, he found himself in a situation where he was exposed to a lot of information, and he also was exposed to travel, to be able to go to England and other parts of the world. And as a consequence of his development, his experience, he enrolled into Harvard University, but they wouldn't accept his bachelor's degree from Fisk University. He graduated from Fisk in 1888. So he had to really do over most of his bachelor's degree at Harvard. And then he went on ultimately to get a doctorate degree at Harvard. So he graduated from Harvard, and he ended up with a doctorate in sociology by 1995. So he had an academic experience that placed him as the first black graduate of Harvard in that particular field. And in addition to that, what was very significant about Du Bois was that he held a worldview by this time that he acknowledged the existence of racism in the world, but beyond that, he went on to, he wrote a book in 1897. And the book that he wrote in 1897 was called The Conservation of Races. And in this book, what he talked about was the fact that, first of all, race is not a biological construct. You can't go and examine and find race. You can look at superficial characteristics and you can kind of guess at it, and there's lines between, because there are people that are heavily melanated who have various types of features, and then of course there are YT people and all shades in between. So he acknowledged this and recognized that the race is not really it's not a biological construct. He identified it as a sociological construct, and he pointed out the fact that it is real as if it were a biological construct. And so in looking at and understanding that race is a real thing, it's a sociological construct, he looked at how race impacted humanity worldwide, and the fact that there was a worldwide system of YT supremacy that had actually conquered most of the world, and that there were multiple colonial empires that were built on the foundation of racism, and this was something that was tangible. So to deny the existence of race and say, well, we're all brothers and sisters and there's no such thing as race, he saw that as a bunch of hogwash. He knew that that was not something that was real, because it was a real situation that YT supremacy was, in fact, the foundational basis of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, and multiple European empires that controlled territories all around the world. And in fact, the Berlin Conference was a assertion of YT supremacy over the continent of Africa. So he recognized these things, and he became I would say one of the first of multiple, because there were others, one of the first international black thinkers of black people who thought on an international level. And so he saw the problem in America. He recognized the race problem in America, but he saw it as a worldwide problem and not just a national problem. And he understood that the national issue could not be solved unless the total international context was addressed. he had enough experience and knowledge to be able to look at this and understand the past efforts, because he did take a lot of effort to engage in historical study. And so this book, Conservation of Races, he said that race is is the most ingenious human invention in history. In other words, he's saying that this is something that each group of people, each race, actually is part of an identity group that organize and they act and they do things in the world, and each has its own legacy. And so he talked about the fact that black people have a legacy to discover and a legacy to fulfill. And so he looked at race as something that should be accepted with pride, that we should seek to understand Africa and understand our heritage, and in it that we would find the fulfillment of our purpose. And so this book, The Conservation of Races, actually looked at race in a positive light, and it looked at it as something that should be used to galvanize the black community, to organize the black community to overcome the situation that it was in. Because worldwide, black people were in the position that they were in because of this concept of race and because of this concept of white supremacy. And so he identified this early on in his career. And so by 1897, of course, he's a scholar, at this time, he's a doctorate and all those things. And then, of course, there's these groups of folks, Henry Sylvester Williams. There's actually a group of people called the African Association that they are in school in London. And so it's some black students that are from the Caribbean, from Haiti, from Sierra Leone, from Liberia, from multiple other places around the world, and South Africa, etc. And so this group of students, they get together and they're talking about this issue of what is going on in the world, what is happening to black people worldwide. This is not long after Ethiopia. Italy attempted to attack and overthrow Ethiopia and take control of it, but they lost at the Battle of Adwa. And so, the Ethiopians had resisted and had stood firm and continued to maintain their independence. And it was one of the last strongholds of black independence. And so their win was a sense of pride, created a sense of pride in black people all over the world, in fact. And so in terms of looking at what's going on at this particular time, this group of students called the Africa Association, they decided to organize a conference to talk about, particularly in the British Empire, to look at the condition that black people were experiencing in the British Empire. And because Dubois was known, and because of his scholarly work that had already been published by this time, they called on Dubois. And of course, Dubois brought in Bishop Alexander Walters and a number of other people, and they organized the very first Pan-African conference in 1900. And this conference that they organized also was endorsed by Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington was also well known at that time for Tuskegee Institute and for his work in education in America. And he was considered a very prominent figure in the black community in the Americas. And so he endorsed this conference. He wrote a letter in support of it, though he didn't attend himself. He did endorse it. And so when the conference was actually held, something very significant and profound occurred. And that is, during this first conference, W.E.B. Du Bois really rose to leadership because he wrote something, and this thing he wrote was actually done in conjunction with a number of people that he collaborated with. But this collaboration that he did resulted in something called Address to the Nations of the World. Address to the Nations of the World. And you can pull a copy of it. You can look it up and pull it off the internet. There's a Du Bois collection at the University of Amherst in Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And there's a Du Bois collection there. And you can get a copy of it there. But it's called Address to the Nations of the World. And in this Address to the Nations of the World, what Du Bois did was he wrote about and he acknowledged what was going on globally. He talked about the things that were happening globally, and he made a direct appeal and address to the Queen of England and to the heads of state of all the major European powers and other powers around the world. And he focused on asking them to acknowledge and protect the rights of people of African descent. And the reason he did this because there were all kinds of atrocities going on at this time. King Leopold had been in the Belgian Congo, the so-called Congo Free State. He was committing all kinds of atrocities that resulted in from 10 to 15 million black people unalived in the Congo. Cecil Rhodes was in Southeast Africa. Some 50 million black people were unalived. The development of De Beers diamonds and the whole diamond industry development and enslaving black people in mining and all those kinds of things were going on. And then the Germans had Southwest Africa. They had multiple territories. They had Togo, they had Cameroon, they had Southwest Africa, they had Namibia, they had what they call Shark Island. And they also had territories in East Africa. And there were all kinds of atrocities being committed in these places. And so it was a terrible situation going on the African continent. And in addition to that, there had been recent efforts to try to overthrow Ethiopia. There were threats against Liberia, and there were also threats against Haiti. And so Du Bois spoke up on all of these things, and he advocated against attacks on free, independent black countries like Ethiopia, Abyssinia, Liberia, and Haiti. And he also advocated to protect the rights of black people in these colonial territories. And what he did was he spoke about these issues and said that the question of the 20th century would be the question of the color line. And in essence, he issued a warning, a global warning that you can't just do this to black people and just keep getting away with it and it's okay. We have to find a way to find a solution to this. And so he began to argue for independence. And so with this address to the nations of the world, this changed his status because it actually put him in all of the capitals of all the major countries of the world, where he's now an advocate and spokesperson articulating the issues of the entire black world. He's talking about what's happening in Africa. He's talking about independent black countries that exist at this time. He's talking about lynching. He's talking about in the American South. He's talking about the atrocities that are being committed against black people in the United States and the Caribbean and South America. So he's shining a light on what's going on in the world and in defiance of the stereotype about, black folk not being educated and, not being intelligent. He is articulating and he's very eloquently talking about the conditions that exist worldwide and what is happening to black people. And he's asking them to take action, to don't do this, because you're claiming that you're a civilized group of people, but look at what you are doing. And so it's a good read to go and look at that, the address to the nations of the world from 1900. And you also have to remember that at this time, there's no League of Nations, there's no United Nations, there is only something called the Concert of Europe. And this was a forum where European countries got together and they would meet to talk and resolve issues to try to reduce the chances of them going to war with each other. In addition to that, there was the Hague Peace Conference. There was one that was held in 1899, the year before the first Pan-African Conference. And I don't think that it's significant, or I think that it's very significant that the first conference was held 1 year after this Hague Peace Conference, because what they did, they began to speak on this issue of peace and how to move forward, the world forward, and to be able to communicate with the players and participants in these various different forums and international groups that are talking about trying to, harmonize and bring peace and eliminate war and conflict and have economic prosperity and all these things. And he's coming to the table saying, look, Black people need to have independence. Black people need to have, access to be able to be participants, to get education, to do all these kinds of things and not be just exploited economically. And so his challenge was that you can't just exploit us economically and run over us and do like Leopold's doing or Cecil Rhodes is doing or many of the others that were doing all kinds of atrocities against Black people at the time. So he became an articulate spokesperson for Pan-Africanism. And his speech and his talk, his articulation, his writings for Pan-Africanism and his setting the mark saying that the question of the 20th century would be the question of the color line. And then he published a book 3 years later, The Souls of Black Folk, where he put forward this issue as well. And so about the color line. So when we began to look at what Du Bois is doing and what he's talking about this time, it's very significant because we can see that he's having a profound impact worldwide, because not only is he a published author that people can read his books and his materials at this point, because he's also published the famous Philadelphia Negro study. He's done some other works, and and by 1911, he actually organizes a conference on race. And this conference on race that he organized, it wasn't at the level of the Pan-African Conference, but it was very significant, and it was something that preceded the World War I. And so Du Bois actually articulated, what was going on globally, and his writings and his statements likely had a very significant impact on the coming of World War I. Because what he did was he articulated what was going on, the atrocities that were taking place, and this actually resulted in a lot of people look at, and you hear about for World War I, they say, well, the Archduke of Austria was assassinated, and you had these certain things happen, but they never talk about the underlying issues, because all these countries that seem to be prosperous and successful, their success was based in the exploitation of the African countries. And of course, you had the Ottoman Empire that had influence and control in Africa. You had all of these things that had taken place. And then, of course, you at the Berlin Conference, the interests of these particular players at the table, because remember that the Ottoman Empire is at the table at the Berlin Conference. They have a seat at the table. So does Russia. So does the United States. And so in terms of Du Bois is seeing this as an international forum of all of the different players. And what he's doing is he's stepping in and he's saying, look, I'm speaking to you on behalf of Black people worldwide. And he's also noting the fact that, look, we understand that Africa has been devastated, plundered, and you guys have divided it up. And you now rule over it. You also took about 32.5 million black people into slavery. And you took about 12.5 million of them through the transatlantic slave trade, and you took them to the Americas. In addition to that, you took about 11 million through the trans-Sahara slave trade and about 9 million through the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade. And so he's not only just talking to the he's not just talking to the Europeans, he's also talking to the Ottoman Empire. He's talking about all of the players on the global stage, and he's talking about, if you want to bring about some peace and world order, we're going to have to do something to address this problem of the treatment of black people, and we need to have some kind of international forum to do this. So he's already advocating a global infrastructure in order to bring about peaceful conditions and mutual cooperation worldwide. And he's also advocating for black people to have a seat at the table worldwide, not just from the Americas, not just from Africa, but black people worldwide. And so Du Bois then plays this role for this first Pan-African conference. He does a second type of conference that was the race conference in 1911. He's published multiple books by this time. He also organized the Niagara Movement along with William Monroe Trotter in the United States in 1905. And this Niagara Movement was advocating self-defense of black people. It was advocating for the ending of lynching and Jim Crow segregation and the mistreatment of black people in the United States. And so in addition to this, in terms of the Niagara Movement, by 1907 or so, there's something called the Springfield riots that take place. So 1909, the Springfield riots that took place in Massachusetts. And it was a major race riot in Springfield, Illinois. And so as a response to this major race riot and the tensions that were building, because you have to remember that the Niagara Movement's advocating for self-defense at this point. So black people are saying, look, we're fed up, we ain't taking it no more. And so you're having more and more black people around the country taking this stand. And what happened is that Du Bois actually met with a group of other people that included YT people, other black scholars, and other black leaders. And they organized in response to the Springfield massacre, the Springfield riots. They organized the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Niagara Movement didn't have any funding. It didn't have any real strong means of going forward at that point, and had been largely disbanded. And so Du Bois then came into this group with the NAACP, and he made a deal. And the deal that he would have full editorial control over the Crisis magazine. And of course, they would, help provide resources for this Crisis magazine. And W.E.B. Du Bois then became the editor of the Crisis magazine from 1910 up to about 1934. And this became a major organ or major publication in terms of what was going on in the black community and the scholarship. And it also dealt with international issues. So it became a very important international voice, because not only did it talk about what was happening in America, but it talked about what was happening with black people worldwide and talked about the crisis that was going on. And so this magazine is, and you could go back and pull the archives and look at some of the old issues of the Crisis magazine, and you'll see that it was really at a very scholarly type of journal. And so it became very significant. We look at, a lot of people look at the UNIA and Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, the UNIA organized about 700 chapters of the UNIA in the United States. But the NAACP organized almost 1,500 chapters in the United States. And so it became a much larger organization. It was an organization that provided a means for Black people to express themselves, even though it had some liberal YT support. It was an organization that was largely a Black organization. And so in terms of what they did, and they organized and they were able to set up a legal program. So they spinned off the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So that organization did litigation and fought Jim Crow segregation, fought for civil rights and public accommodations issues and legal matters that dealt with Jim Crow segregation. In addition to that, the Crisis magazine itself was an instrument that had major political influence on Congress, on other bodies globally, because of what it advocated and articulated information. And so during this period of time, even while World War I is going on, Du Bois is hard at work, and he's engaged in sustained advocacy on behalf of Black people, not only Black people in America, though he's at this point a very strong voice that's anti-lynching and for independence of Black people, so that Black people would get education. And he wasn't opposed to Black people getting skills and learning trades. He just thought that wasn't the only way to do it, and that there is a talented group of Black people who have the capability of achieving in higher education, and that have the ability to become doctors and lawyers and engineers and skilled craftsmen and all kinds of things, and play international roles, and diplomats and politicians. And so he wanted that, and not just have Black folk just you get a job and be subservient and just keep your head low and work. He was against that. And so that put him in a public conflict with Booker T. Washington, who in his Atlanta Compromise speech said, "Cash down your buckets where you are, just try to work and try to make some money." And Du Bois said, well, we got to do more than that, because the crisis that we're experiencing, it's global, it's worldwide. We need thinkers. We need people we're not going to be able to work our way out of this. We're going to have to think our way out of this. Du Bois also was put at odds with Marcus Garvey. And part of the issue, of course, Marcus Garvey's movement with him present lasted about 11 years before he was deported. And of course, Garvey did a tremendous work. He was a strong advocate for Black people. And, he had the theme Africa for the Africans at home and abroad and all those kinds of things. But he actually didn't go in Africa. He made an attempt to establish something with Liberia. And of course, that didn't quite work out. And many people think, well, because of Du Bois's influence directly with the government of Liberia, because Du Bois, in terms of his international work through the Pan-African Conference, he was working directly with Liberia. He was working directly with Haiti and directly with Ethiopia, and was a spokesperson that was probably viewed by them as being very significant to their maintaining their independence. So for Garvey to come along and try to push a program and cast him aside and call him names and stuff like that, that didn't fly with them. So, Garvey did a lot of stuff, and he had a tremendous positive impact, but he also did not manage what he was doing very well, and it fell apart, and he ended up arrested, deported, and many people will say that, well, the charges were trumped up and all those kinds of things, and they very well may have been. But the fact of the matter is that Du Bois was, in terms of, if you look at Du Bois's work, Du Bois wasn't in a rivalry with him for the sake of being in a rivalry or because of jealousy or anything like that. I think we can see the writings if you go to the collections and actually look at some of the things that Du Bois said many positive things about Garvey and Garvey's movement. He was very proud of it. He didn't want to be in a conflict with him. He didn't want to be in a conflict with Booker T either. He understood the international implications of that and the fact that the press was doing this. But what happened is that World War I came to an end. And as World War I was coming to an end, Du Bois saw a great opportunity. So, of course, there was the Treaty of Versailles, and the League of Nations was being formed, and there was a Paris Peace Conference being held. And during this Paris Peace Conference, Du Bois organized what became known as the First Pan-African Congress. And notice the distinction that in 1900 it was the First Pan-African Conference. And some people call the 1919 event the Second Pan-African Conference. But if you study it, you technically understand that there was only one Pan-African Conference. And then after that, there were 5 Pan-African Congresses. And Du Bois was the main organizer of 4 of them. And then the 5th one, he was like appointed as chair of the conference, though it was organized by George Padmore, who was actually a great nephew of Henry Sylvester Williams, who organized the very first Pan-African Conference. But in terms of this Pan-African Congress that took place in 1919, it actually was organized right across from where the Paris Peace Conference was held. And, there was a couple of days gap or whatever. But what happened is that they developed an agenda, and they developed also a document called Address to the Nations of the World, very similar to 1900. And this new Address to the Nations of the World was actually done where it would have a direct impact on the organizing of the League of Nations. And what they did was they called for a code of law for international protection of the African people. They demanded education for every black child. They requested the League of Nations to guarantee greater security of life and property of black people, and to extend protections to labor, so people couldn't be just exploited labor and forced to work in mines and all that. And even though they weren't slaves, they were living the life of a slave. So Du Bois advocated against these things that were going on. In addition to that, he also advocated for hands-off for Ethiopia, Liberia, and Haiti. And of course, at this time, the United States had occupied Haiti in 1915. So he became a strong advocate about the independence of Haiti, that America back off and allow Haiti to be able to be independent and not be exploited, though it was being exploited by America at the time. And so he was an international voice that was a very strong voice. And also something that was very, very significant about this this conference in 1919, that was a very strong voice. And also something that was very, very significant about this this conference in 1919 is that you have to remember that Germany controlled Togoland, Germany controlled Cameroon, Germany controlled Southwest Africa, the areas of Namibia and part of Angola, and all the way down into what they call Shark Island, those coastal islands, where the Shark Island massacres occurred, and where Germans actually had organized the first concentration camps before they did the same in World War II. And they also controlled parts of Tanzania and other parts of East Africa. It was actually a very significant large territory controlled by Germany. And of course, Germany lost the war, and they lost control of their colonial possessions in Africa. And the League of Nations actually set up a mandate system. And this mandate system assigned various countries that had been liberated, in essence, from the Ottoman Empire, from the Germans, and from Austria-Hungary, that those countries that were the colonial territories, they were assigned to various allied countries from Europe. And those countries under the mandate system would manage those countries until they became independent. And it set up a mandate system, and it gave them a certain number of years to achieve it and all those things. And so Britain also had what they call the mandate for Palestine, and they had mandates where they actually gained control of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Iraq. All that region was under the control of the British, because all those territories had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire lost the war, and they were then put under mandate through the League of Nations. Also, there were parts of Africa that went to the French and the British as a result of this mandate system. But in addition to that, when we look at the overall situation, what Dubois did, Dubois became a strong voice and advocate to say, hey, look at what Belgium did in the Congo. They gave it to Leopold, and he just massacred the people. Look at what happened in the past. Look at all these things. And what he did was he proposed that the League of Nations itself, as an international body, manage those territories and not give them to a single European country. And that those colonial territories would actually be managed by this international body until they could become independent, so that they could organize and become independent. And this was a solution that Du Bois proposed. And this was a solution that became very strongly part of the debate in the international discussion. And so this was Du Bois, in essence, even though he wasn't a country, he had a seat at the table. Even though he didn't sit at the table, his ideals, his thoughts, his writings were so profound that they impacted the whole global discussion about what to do with the German territories, and what to do in the so-called Middle East, and what to do in terms of how to proceed and move forward. And so this address to the nations of the world in the 1919 Pan-African Conference, the first Pan-African Congress, was very, very significant. And Du Bois advocated for self-determination of all of Black Africa, and also for Black people that were colonized, so that Black people could decide whether they wanted to remain a part of a country or whether they wanted to have independence. So Du Bois is advocating this and arguing these things in an international forum, in an international marketplace, in essence. And so he's under major, major threat, because he's viewed as like, this guy is like, what is he doing? It's a Black guy. He's in the middle of the international public square, and he's talking all of this stuff, and he's saying all these things, and people are listening to him. So the United States becomes alarmed, right? And so does France and England and all of that. So what they started doing was, as he organized the 1921 Pan-African Conference, they went to work to try to, block passports, deny visas, and to try to hinder him from being able to organize, to hinder Black people from becoming involved and coming together in one voice. So this became an effort of these countries began to try to squash him. And then also the Bureau of Investigation began to look at him to see what they could find, what they could do, to try to shut him down. And but he went on to hold several other significant events in 1921, 1923, and 1927. He held the second Pan-African Conference, Pan-African Congress in 1921, in 1923, the third, and the fourth in 1927. And it became very, very significant that each of these conferences actually monitored and did what they call a manifesto. They did resolutions, and they looked at what was going on in the world and how this process was moving forward in terms of the countries that had mandates for these territories. They're commenting. These are black folks commenting. And Du Bois is the leader of it. Du Bois is the one, he's the one, the main writer. He's the one organizing this. And he's an articulate spokesperson as to what's going on and what's happening. And what's happening is he's now gaining international support and international recognition from around the world. And so this Pan-African movement is a growing movement. So you have more and more countries and more groups of people that are involved, that are connected now, because you have black people coming out of all of the different colonial territories from all around the world who are now speaking up and becoming advocates and becoming participants in these conferences. And they are having to come up with different strategies to and ingenuity to try to work their way around the barriers that these countries try to put up to block them. And of course, as they went on, these Pan-African conferences began to really build a substantial amount of momentum. In addition to that, Du Bois, at the same time, he's publishing through the Crisis magazine, which is a voice that's constantly advocating. In addition to that, between 1930 and the 1940s, Du Bois actually begins to teach at Atlanta University, becomes a professor. And he's also, a professor at a number of other colleges or whatever. And he is actually grooming young scholars. There's people coming from Africa and places that are on student visas and stuff. And he's becoming an increasing influence in terms of advocating for African independence. And so he writes a book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction. He examines what happened after slavery in America. He wrote a book called Black Folks Then and Now in 1939, talking about, black people, how they were then, but here's how we are now. And it's a whole different day. In addition, he wrote a book called Dusk of Dawn in 1940. And in 1944, he wrote an autobiographical type of book called My Evolving Program for Negro Freedom in 1944. And it's very interesting, to examine. I think that it's important study to look at the 1921 Pan-African Conference, and they demanded absolute racial equality. They advocated for an end of policies that were based on the concept of racial inferiority. And what he did was he debunked white supremacy to say, hey, look, this is not real. This is all fake. And he's putting information out there to say, look, y'all got to abandon that. And by this time, there's been the Piltdown Scholar scandal. There's been all kinds of things that has debunked the concept of white supremacy. They know that it's just pure racism and that it is political. And so Du Bois is in the 1921 conference, he's advocating. In 1923 conference, he's advocating for self-governments. He's asking for civil rights and the abolition of slavery and forced labor in certain places, because there was still slavery and forced labor going on, especially in the Muslim countries that had been under the Ottoman Empire, that now were under mandate, British mandate, or League of Nations mandate. In addition to that, by 1927, he's still arguing for self-determination, education, economic justice, racial equality, and he's also standing up for not only Haiti, but he's also standing up against South Africa and what's going on in South Africa. And he also, at that point, is advocating for independence of Egypt, China, and India. And he's also advocating for in the Caribbean, there were about 10 islands that had populations that were 90% or more that were black people of African descent. And he's advocating for their independence at the same time. Of course, they're advocating too, but he's now an international voice speaking up for this. And to bring all of these bodies of people and all these groups together under the umbrella of Pan-Africanism with the goal, the liberation of Africa and building an international community. And so this is the work that he's engaged in. And so he, in the 1927, the Fourth Pan-African Conference, he's actually making demands on the United States government to withdraw from Haiti, which they had under control at that time. He, in addition, is condemning apartheid in South Africa, and he's advocating, of course, for this independent forum, of Caribbean islands to become a federation of these Caribbean islands. And so when we began to really look at and understand what he's doing, he is doing some very, very profound things. And then, we look at not only look at what he's doing in terms of these conferences. In 1945, Dubois was about 77 years old. So he's like considered an elder statesman at this point. And he, in fact, is appointed as the chair of the Fifth Pan-African Conference. And at this Fifth Pan-African Conference, you have people like Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, you have Jomo Kenyatta, you have Azukawi, who became president of Nigeria. You have a bunch of black folk there from Africa who ultimately become heads of state in Africa. And the tone became increasingly intense at the Fifth Pan-African Conference that took place in 1945. And of course, Du Bois is arguing for independence. He's asking for unequivocal independence. In other words, saying, look, you're taking too long in terms of organizing and doing these things. And, under the mandate system, you should have been letting these countries become independent. And so he's now demanding their independence. And he's actually appointed as the international president of the Pan-African Conference. And so after this, you see a bunch of independence movement takes place in Africa. So all of a sudden now you got the Mau Mau, you got all kinds of independent black organizations developing that are revolutionary organizations that are developing in Africa. And it is their attempts at, they're doing stuff like work strikes, national strikes where people are like, well, we're not working all week. We're not going to work in the mines. We're not going to work in agriculture until you give us independence. And what happened is this became a movement all across the Africa, and it became the African Liberation Movement. So Du Bois is centered at this in terms of, from an ideological standpoint, he has driven this and pushed this whole thing into motion. And so by 1947, in 1947, Du Bois writes another document, and it's called An Appeal to the World. And this is, at this point, the United Nations has been formed. And he's already been writing to the United Nations and lobbying the United Nations members and all that. And it's like 58 United Nations members, and he's talking with each country. And so he writes this paper on behalf of the NAACP in 1947. And it's an appeal to the world. And he's actually asking all the nations of the world to consider the issue of human rights and establish an international standard. And what happens is the next year, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is passed. And of course, the United States they had groups. They had Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and many others involved in terms of their delegation. But Du Bois wrote letters to their delegation. Du Bois advocated. They, of course, at one point, Eleanor Roosevelt got mad with him because he was embarrassing them, because he was putting all their laundry out in an international forum. And, he was meeting with international leaders. And he was he was meeting with like Mao Zedong and Khrushchev, and so they were looking at this and saying, well, you can't do this. You can't, you're just a regular citizen. You can't do this. But he continued, and what they did, they pulled his passport in 1951 so that he could not, his visa, so that he could not travel abroad. And they literally put him under house arrest where he couldn't travel internationally. He didn't have a passport and he didn't have the ability to leave the country. And so during this period of time, he continued to write, he continued to advocate, but this Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed, and it established an international standard. And this was very significant because there never had been in the history of the world an international standard of how people should treat each other. Now, the Geneva Conventions primarily dealt with war. There were like 4 different Geneva Conventions, but it dealt with war-type situations. This was the first time there was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that said, okay, this is the etiquette of how we treat each other as human beings on the earth, on the planet. And everyone should have a right to education. We should have food and water, and all these things are basic human rights. And so this was the very first time there was a Declaration of Human Rights. And this was a game changer. And what happened is in 1955, even though Du Bois was banned from travel, he sent a writing called the Proposed African Declaration of Independence. And this Declaration of Independence in 1955 was read at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. And 2 years later, Ghana became the first post-colonial independent Black African country. And then after that, they fell like dominoes. And what happened is you had within the next 10 years, you had about 33 or 34 independent Black African countries rise. And this became an important game changer because what it did was with these independent Black African countries, it changed the negotiating power. So Black people in America having a civil rights movement, instead of being in a vacuum and all alone, now they're in an international forum. There are countries all over the world looking at what is happening in America. There are countries all over the world looking at this Universal Declaration of Human Rights and saying, well, are the human rights of Black people in America being violated? And so this gave support to Martin Luther King. In addition to that, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which Du Bois was instrumental in pushing into existence, they got Plessy versus Ferguson overturned with Brown versus Board of Education in 1955 and ended Jim Crow segregation, legal Jim Crow segregation. So this began to transform America. And so when we look at Du Bois and his work and how it impacted Black civil rights, Black voting rights, and the opportunities that Blacks got as a result of the Black Democratic Alliance and the civil rights movement, that he had a profound impact on that progress. And he had the same type of impact all over the Black world, whether it's in Brazil or Colombia, Mexico, all over. He had an impact. And in addition to this, also something I think that's very, very significant to take a look at, when we think of Du Bois and his work, in addition to this Universal Declaration of Human Rights coming into being, he also was had a very significant impact on the discussion because once you had a group of independent black countries formed, following Du Bois's ideal of Pan-Africanism, there was what was called the Monrovia Group and the Casablanca Group. And the Casablanca Group called for immediate, African unity in a single country, and they called for certain things. And the Monrovia Group said that, well, we have to secure what we have first and solidify that. And we also need to promise not to interfere in each other's sovereignty. And we need to establish certain principles. And what happened is this group debated back and forth. In 1961, they organized the Organization of African Unity. And this organization of these groups organized in 1961, and then they all came together in 1963 and organized, formalized, and settled their differences and established the Organization of African Unity in 1963. And then in 1964, they invited Malcolm X and the Organization of African American Unity to invite the African diaspora to have a seat at the table. And because black people in America were the most organized at that point, to be able to bring someone from the African diaspora to sit at the table. And so this Organization of African Unity then began to work and to organize and develop regional policies and programs to try to build the infrastructure of Africa. And of course, they were in a constant battle because there was always international interference from various different outsiders from Europe, America, Asia, etc., all fighting over trying to get access to Africa's mineral resources and control the territories and take its wealth. There were even still countries that were taking people in essence enslaving them, especially in the Arab world. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding the fact of the matter is that I'm in this in terms of looking at this and understanding the reality of where we are. There's a saying that says that no weapon formed against me will prosper, and those that rise up against me shall I condemn. So you're condemning yourself if you come after me. But in any event, let me go ahead and I don't need to say any more on that. We'll just see what happens. And so in terms of looking at the this Organization of African Unity, by 2002, it changed its constitutional structure and became the Africa Union. And they also adopted as part of their constitution something called the Zone 6. So they had 5 different zones on the African continent, and then Zone 6 is the African diaspora, and that's black people outside of the African country all over the world as part of this Africa Union. And so this is part of the fulfillment of the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And if we look at it, what we see unfolding is an extension of the work of Du Bois and Pan-Africanism. And I think it's important also. I want to talk about one of the last things that Du Bois, of course, he passed in 1963 on August 27th. And of course, that was announced at the August 28th March on Washington in 1963, where the Ossie Davis, made it, talked about him, and Roy Wilkins also made the announcement. And this was where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And this was a culmination of the life of W.E.B. Du Bois, And so it was at a critical height, a critical point, because this was a highlight of the Black movement worldwide. When he was announced at the 1963 March on Washington. But one of the things that Du Bois did before he transitioned, he worked on a project called the Encyclopedia Africana. And his proposal for the Encyclopedia Africana, you can read about it. You can find it in his writings. And actually, he had like about 380 some boxes of materials that he accumulated as part of his work, and as part of the library collection that's now at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He also has materials that are in multiple other collections around the country and in Africa. So in terms of looking at Du Bois's work and looking at this Encyclopedia Africana, it gave us a vision, it gave us a blueprint for something that has not yet been achieved. And that is that an encyclopedia that actually documents the history of Africa. But in addition to documenting the history of Africa, it also was proposed to document the history of Black Americans in the United States against Black people in the Caribbean and Central and South America, and Black people that were transferred into the Islamic world, and also Black people that were taken by the Dutch and others into other parts of Asia. Because Black people were not only dispersed into the Americas, they were also taken all over the world. And there was actually 20 million people taken to other parts of the world that are outside of Africa and that are not part of the Americas. So there were more people, Black people of African descent, taken in other parts of the world than there are in the Americas. And so in terms of understanding this history and being able to recognize what Pan-Africanism really means, when you look at, you're talking about 700 million Black people worldwide that are in the diaspora, and another 1.3 billion in Africa, on the continent itself. So in terms of looking at it and understanding this, Du Bois is actually proposing doing an encyclopedia to bring all this information together. And he actually began to organize the writers and players in this. And of course, it did not materialize as of yet, but they did do at least a version of a Encyclopedia Africana and several other versions of encyclopedias, but never have gone quite that far. And as a matter of fact, when you talk to folk, scholars and all that, many Black scholars even are not fully conscious of the extent of the Black diaspora, the African diaspora. And so this is very significant. So when you look at the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois and the title Father of Pan-Africanism, we can actually look at and point to tangible things that happen in terms of Black global progress. And even the progress of Black America would not have taken place had it not been for the intellect and the perseverance and the tenacity and the hard work of W.E.B. Du Bois in his lifetime, and his commitment to Black people worldwide, and his commitment to the cause of Pan-Africanism. And so when we look at the whole ideal of what's going on, we see today, for example, 54 independent Black African countries, actually 57. We have about 20 Black countries now that have launched satellites into space, that have their own telecommunication systems. We see auto manufacturing developing in Africa. We see Innoson in Kia Motors and Mobius Motors and Katanka Motors. And we see a developing automobile industry in Africa focusing on electric vehicles. In addition to that, we see the Grand Ethiopian Hydroelectric Dam develop and provide energy to an entire region around Ethiopia. In addition, we have the Inga Hydroelectric Dam in Congo, which will provide energy to a large region for its development. In terms of There is the development of high-speed rail systems connecting cities all across the African continent. In addition to that, there are highway systems being developed right now. They're partnering with China and other countries for development to take place. And there's a shift in the relationship in terms of, in the past, it's been an exploiter-exploitee relationship between particularly the West, Europe and America, and Africa has always been exploiters of Africa. Today, there's a shift in the direction of true partnerships. And so black people have begun to progress to the point now where they can engage in true partnerships in terms of looking at their own internal development. So you see all kinds of major development taking place on the African continent. And you have a lot of resistance from this because you still have white supremacists like our president today who they don't want to see this kind of thing happening. But they know that America needs the resources from Rwanda and from Congo and other places. And so in terms of understanding where we are in historical context, we are in a situation where black Americans, we're under attack. Because what's happening is they don't want you to know this history. They don't want you to understand from whence we've come and what has happened and the struggle to get us to where we are. They want you to fight against each other and to believe false things, you know, like you're an Indian or you're Asiatic black or you're a Moor or you're a Hebrew, rather than understanding that 95% of black America's African ancestors come from sub-Saharan black Africa between modern Senegal and Angola. And a little less than 5% come from Southeast Africa and Madagascar. So we have no physical connection. You go get DNA tests, and it's very rare. It's very anomalous for black people in America to have any North African DNA. Any. And so when we began to look at this and understand who we are, our history tells us who we are. And it's important for us to actually study our history and embrace the identity of who we are and recognize what Du Bois talked about back in 1897 when he wrote the book, The Conservation of Races, that we have to conserve our identity. We have to establish and actually live up to who we are in historical context because we have an important role to play in the world as a group of people. And so you look at what's happening in Africa now, you see not only these highway systems and like the Loboto Corridor Project, and you see African stock markets, and you see port expansions and industrial development. You see a developing tourist industry. You know, at one point, black folk, if you wanted to go on a vacation, you went either to the Caribbean or you went to Europe somewhere. You want to go to Paris, or you want to, see the Eiffel Tower. You want to go to Italy. But now black people are beginning to recognize the beauty in Africa. Some of the most breathtaking nature scenes, some of the most beautiful places exist in Africa. The most pristine beaches on earth are on the African coastlines or on islands off the coast. So in terms of tourism and looking at those kinds of things, black people are becoming more and more conscious to understand what Africa really means. And so you have so many people who are running from, they don't want to be black. They're trying to hide from being African. And in terms of, of looking at the reality, the bottom line is that race, it has nothing to do with pigmentation, it has nothing to do with color, it has nothing to do with any of that. As Du Bois tried to point out in 1898, it is a mental and sociological construct. And so in terms of, you have black folk, in terms of a black consciousness, the unifying theme of blackness, because you have the world was populated by melanated people. Even YT people have melanocytes as part of their skin structure. And so in terms of understanding what melanin is and its function and getting away from the mythology associated with it, it's like recognizing the fact that this is not significant. What is most significant is because I'll also say people like John Brown and others, there are YT people that have supported black people more than some of the chicken-eating Negroes, right? But the point of the matter is that when we take a look at it, the word black is a polysemous word. It is something that's like you say, okay, the dog barked, or you say that there's bark on a tree. It's the same word, but it has different meanings. It's polysemous, or polysemous words, right? The word black is polysemous. So while it is a word that describes a color that's in the spectrum of colors, or the absence of color, however you want to say it, that's not what's significant. That doesn't matter. That's not what's important. What is most important is this, is that the word black describes an experience of a group of people who are bound together by a common experience. And that common experience started in 652 CE, when the Arabs began to invade, came through Egypt and began to invade Nubia to take black people into slavery using a system of chattel slavery. So the system of chattel slavery began, and the African Holocaust began in 652. And from there, 11 million black people were taken through the trans-Saharan slave trade. 9 million were taken through the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade. And then 12.5 million were taken through the transatlantic slave trade. And when we look at what happened in Africa, Africa was devastated. And then it was divided into colonial territories at the Berlin Conference in 1884. There was a Holocaust that took place, and millions of Africans, hundreds of millions of Africans on the continent were unalived. And in addition to that, some 32.5 million were taken into slavery worldwide. And so that's the African Holocaust. And that's in terms of when we talk about black, that's what we're talking about. The people who share that common experience. That's who black people are. So you can talk about, we in different shades, or all black people are not alike, or you can say all of that stuff, but that's just really a sign of you've got some growing to do. The point of the matter is that we have a common history, we have a common heritage, a common experience. And what Du Bois was focusing on, was talking about, is, hey, we have to embrace each other and understand that there are groups of people who have identified themselves based on race, and they're out to try to destroy us because of our race. They are out to try to exploit us on the basis of our race. They are, when you begin to take a look at the actual history and see what is happening, Du Bois has not advocated, at one point, Du Bois did advocate, well, we have to do whatever we got to do in order to gain our independence. But his overall theme has been cooperation and working together and building a harmonious society. Why? Because Du Bois also had a vision and understanding of the issues of world poverty, of health crisis, pandemics, diseases, and all these kinds of things. Du Bois also is aware of the geological issues that were involved, even at his earlier times. If you actually delve into Du Bois's writings and his work, the bottom line is that when you look at Du Bois's vision for the future, Du Bois had a vision for the future of black people. We just have to stand up and play our role. We have to liberate and uplift ourselves. We have to develop ourselves, our education, our skills, our knowledge. We have to clean up our communities. We have to build ourselves up and stand in an international forum and play our role in history. and become whom we are in terms of our historical identity. And of course, Du Bois also very early on noted our connection to ancient Egypt and ancient Nile Valley civilization. He was one of the early historians that wrote about it. And so in terms of looking at this and recognizing this ideal of why is it that Du Bois was called the father of Pan-Africanism, is because Pan-Africanism was something that he advocated very strongly. And he dedicated his whole life's work toward promoting this whole concept of Pan-Africanism and putting forward this ideal and working to make it happen. And in terms of Black leaders, in terms of tangible progress that Black people have made, we can actually look at and measure the tangible progress that Black people have made worldwide and in the United States as a consequence of the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. Many people will try to focus on and say, oh, well, he was a communist or he was a socialist or he was this or that or whatever. But Du Bois was an academic. Du Bois was a man who advocated for Pan-Africanism. He advocated for the liberation of the African continent and the liberation of Black people worldwide. So that Black people could, he didn't promote a back to Africa movement. He promoted the ideal that Black people, we're all over the world, and we have large populations of people that it's not even realistic to think that we would try to move all back to Africa. That we have to actually stand in the places that we are and build up our communities in those places and work together and build mutual cooperation, global cooperation with Africa at the center. And this is where the whole ideal of Pan-Africanism, how it plays out. So in terms of looking at the situation, like for example, Firmerman, Antor Firmerman, he was part of the initial group of the the African Association. There were multiple others who were part of that initial group that started in 1897. And so in terms of this topic, I could go on and talk about Du Bois. Du Bois is one of those characters that he has such a body of information. He had 380 some boxes of materials of his writings and artifacts that he created as part of his academic work during his lifetime that are on collection at the Du Bois collection at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So I encourage everyone to study up on him, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I hope this has been enlightening and beneficial. And you know, when I had raised a question about looking at, you know, how does Du Bois compare to, you know, like Douglass and Washington and Garvey and Noble Drew Ali or Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X or Dr. King. And in reality, I don't compare them. They all had different roles to play, and they all did significant work. But I think it's very important to really, truly understand the work that Du Bois did, because Du Bois's work is very, very significant, and it is very misunderstood in many parts of the Black community. So with that, thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.